In last week's episode of the Jason Hassett Show, we delved deep into the JFK assassination, the how and what happened on that day, as well as the long cover-up afterwards. But many of you in the comments pointed out something that I didn't cover in that episode, and that is the theory that Israel, and specifically Mossad, had its hands all over this assassination, and why this was massively important if Israel ever wanted to build nuclear weapons, given that JFK was pressuring them not to. But is there any truth to it? Well, that's what we're going to dive into in this episode of the Jason Hassett Show. I am Jason Hassett, and this is the Israel JFK conspiracy explained.
Do it live!
I am not going to exploit.
A Pizza Express in Woking.
Your line of questioning is transphobic.
Now watch this drive.
Fucking thing sucks!
Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jason Hassett Show, where today we're going to go through a conspiracy that is a pretty wild one and I'm sure will offend a lot of people, but my apologies on that. That is not my intention. Essentially, last week we dropped the JFK companion episode to the JFK documentary that's coming out, or that came out, sorry, on Friday on my main channel, the documentary channel, which is linked below. And you can go watch that. And there was a lot of comments on both videos, both the JFK documentary, which went very much into the why, and the companion episode, which went very much into the how, about the Israel connection to the assassination. And I had noted this kind of briefly while I was looking at both of the videos, but not really delved in. It didn't seem like there was much there. But from the comments, it seems like there is more to this. So I've done what we do on this channel, and if you're new here, essentially we go and take research from the interwebs, which is vastly unreliable, and we go through it together in this episode. And the main reason I flagged that is because I'm sure, given, like I said, this comes from the interwebs, there will be parts of this that are incorrect or just, violently false. And therefore, I would like you guys to let me know in the comments below if I have missed anything really important that perhaps could have skewed my opinions, or if there's something interesting you think needs to be added, or if we've just got something wrong. And the comment section should be a place where we can all learn together. And the great part about that is, because of comments from you wonderful people, I have decided to do this very episode, because clearly there is something I've missed here. So I want to jump into this. And while you're down there, you might as well hit that like button, subscribe, and pop that notification bell, because importantly, it gives me some cash if I get to 1,000 subscribers, which is all I really want right now, and I'm on 333. So we've got a long way to go. So without ado, let's jump in to this episode on the JFK Israel connections to the assassination, if there are any, which there seems to be. Okay, so to understand this theory, obviously we need to go back in time to get the context of this. So we need to kind of grasp the intense dispute between JFK's administration and Israel, specifically over nuclear weapons. And remember as well that this is in the build-up to the 67 war. It was after the 48 war, I want to say. And at this point, Israel was a very, very new country, having only been founded in 1947. And, it was trying to establish itself in a very, very hostile region. And this was at a time when two countries were kind of in a similar vein. You had India and Israel, both of which were essentially set up by the British at the time, who liked to draw lines on maps. Thank you, England. As an Irish person, I'm not too happy about it. But obviously both countries were trying to defend themselves from succumbing to regional forces, and also to ensure that no new empire or colonizer comes in and essentially just sets them back to where they were before. So President Kennedy took office in January of 1961, deeply concerned about the spread of nuclear arms. And in fact, Kennedy was probably the most anti-proliferation president. For anyone wondering what that means, basically he didn't want nuclear weapons rolling out across the globe. He was the most anti-nuclear proliferation president in US history, bearing in mind that nuclear weapons were also as new as Israel. Considering nuclear proliferation his personal private nightmare. Even before his inauguration, JFK had been warned that Israel was secretly building a nuclear reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert, potentially to produce plutonium for bombs. Now, bear in mind as well, there's going to be lots of names of places in Israel and people in Israel here that I'm going to get wrong, and my apologies in advance on that. Weeks before Kennedy assumed office, the outgoing Eisenhower administration discovered the Dimona project, a joint effort between Israel and France, and alerted him that Israel and India were the countries most determined to seek the bomb. With Israel's reactor capable of generating significant weapons-grade plutonium by 1963, just 2 years later. Israel's drive for nuclear capability was spearheaded in the late 1950s by leaders like David Ben-Gurion, then Prime Minister of Israel, and Shimon Peres, who saw atomic bombs as vital to the security of the young nation-state. The Dimona reactor was built with French assistance under great secrecy. By 1960, US intelligence confirmed the existence of the Dimona site, causing consternation in Washington and abroad, especially among Arab states surrounding the area. President Eisenhower pressed Israel for an explanation, and Ben-Gurion publicly claimed the reactor was for peaceful purposes only, basically a research facility, and he said this in December of 1960. Many US officials remained skeptical of this claim from the very beginning. Indeed, a national intelligence estimate at the time concluded that plutonium production for weapons is at least one major purpose of the site. This set the stage for a showdown. Kennedy was determined to stop new nations from getting the bomb, and Israel was equally determined to get a bomb which it saw as existentially important to its existence. So, from his early days in office, from 1961, JFK made Israel's nuclear program a high priority issue. At a final pre-inauguration meeting with Eisenhower on January 19th of 1961, Kennedy's very first question was about which countries were seeking nuclear weapons, and Secretary of State Christian Herter replied immediately, India and Israel, and emphasized an urgent need to inspect Israel's Dimona facility. And Kennedy heeded this advice. Within days of taking office, he met with the Israeli ambassador and pressed for transparency on Dimona. US officials at the time believed vehemently that ensuring that Dimona was a peaceful-only facility was a prerequisite for good US-Israeli relations. In May of 1961, Ben-Gurion and Kennedy held a secret meeting in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, which revolved heavily around the Dimona question. The meeting only occurred after Israel hurriedly allowed a first visit by American scientists to the Dimona site that month. The initial inspection tour was tightly controlled by the Israelis and yielded a reassuring but clearly misleading report. The Americans were told that Dimona was for research and power generation, not bombs. Kennedy was polite but unconvinced. He pressed Ben-Gurion for a commitment of regular inspection going forward, a theme that would reoccur in their correspondence. And a second Dimona visit took place in September of 1962, but it was improvised and exceedingly brief. In fact, it was only 45 minutes, and inspectors didn't even see the full facility. US officials considered the second visit a fiasco, suspecting it was essentially a stage tour that left many questions unanswered. The lack of transparency heightened JFK's suspicions. By late 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's resolve to prevent nuclear proliferation was only strengthened. He now demanded a more concrete action to verify Dimona's purpose. Some analysts believe that Israel's full intention by this point was to keep Dimona's military potential hidden at all costs. One indicator often cited is the false cover stories that were used, for example, calling Dimona a textile plant or a research reactor, and that Israeli intelligence might have been monitoring US intelligence closely. However, the evidence for active Israeli deception from 1961 to 1962 is largely circumstantial, limited access for inspectors, shifting explanations, and so on. What is documented, though, is the US frustration. Kennedy was never wholly satisfied with Israelis' peaceful assertions, and the CIA likewise remained skeptical that Dimona was purely civilian. Basically, the stage was set for confrontation in 1963. By 1963, President Kennedy escalated the issue into a high-stakes diplomatic confrontation. This pivotal year is rich with documented evidence around this of Kennedy's pressure on Israel. And it's also the year conspiracy theorists focus on as the breaking point leading up to JFK's assassination. So let's walk through this step by step and get an idea of the build up to the assassination from this Israel-US side to kind of see if we feel like there's anything that would convince us that they had a proper hand in the assassination. If there's one thing that this story teaches us, it's that secrets don't stay secret forever. Easy for me to say, especially when there are memos, phone calls, and declassified files involved. But your files, yeah, those can stay classified. That's where NordVPN comes in. Whether you're reading the classified archives, researching Cold War conspiracies, or just watching documentaries that somehow aren't available in your country, NordVPN keeps your connection private. Your data's encrypted, your IP address is hidden, and your browsing history stays more secure than the CIA's Dallas itinerary. So go to nordvpn.com/Hassett today to get up to 77% off plus 3 months free on a 2-year deal, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And there's some great Black Friday deals coming up as well. So before you start Googling JFK Files 2025 release on airport Wi-Fi, get NordVPN. Links are in the description below. And now back to the video. In early 1963, after privately warning Israel for 2 years, JFK decided to force the issue. In May of 1963, President Kennedy took the ultimate step that a politician can take to ensure that people listen to him. He sent David Ben-Gurion a strongly worded letter. Now, Kennedy insisted that Israel permit regular US inspections, biannual, every 6 months, not kind of a weird kinky, doesn't matter, of the Dimona reactor to verify that it wasn't being used for weapons production. He warned, in diplomatic but clear terms, that America's commitment to and support of Israel could very seriously be jeopardized if Israel did not provide transparency on this vital issue. This was as close to a threat as one could imagine between allies. JFK essentially linking US military support to this reactor, essentially saying we will no longer supply you weapons. Ben-Gurion, a staunch Israeli nationalist, was reportedly shocked by Kennedy's tone. He delayed responding for 7 days, and when he finally replied on May 27, 1963, Ben-Gurion evaded the demand. In his letter, Ben-Gurion reiterated that Dimona was purely for peaceful research and pointed out that American visits had already occurred, such as have taken place, and proposed delaying any further visit until early 1964, when the reactor would be fully operational, arguing that before then there would be nothing to see here. So he didn't explicitly agree to the regular 6-month inspections that Kennedy wanted, and therefore US officials found this reply less than ideal, less than fully satisfactory was their exact wording, seeing it as a stalling tactic to buy time. In internal memos, Kennedy aides noted that Ben-Gurion's response simply postponed the issue and kept Dimona as a bargaining chip for future Israeli negotiations. So in June of 1963, Kennedy decided to double down. Unwilling to take no for an answer, JFK decided to press even harder. On June 15, 1963, he sent another strongly worded email, essentially a firmer reiteration of his ultimatum. Kennedy's June 15 letter again insisted on the need to create a system of regular biannual visits to Dimona and included the same stark warning that the US support for Israel could seriously be jeopardized if America couldn't get reliable information on Israelis' nuclear intentions. In essence, Kennedy was saying, we need to see Dimona with our own eyes twice a year or our relationship will suffer. Basically, as close as it gets in political terms to a full ultimatum. And then a huge thing happened the next day, either because of this or massively coincidental, because on June 16th, 1963, Ben-Gurion resigned his post as Prime Minister. He stepped down citing personal reasons, catching even many Israelis off guard. The timing has drawn, as you can imagine, intense speculation. Ben-Gurion did not explicitly link his resignation to Kennedy's ultimatum in any public statement. Contemporary reports noted that he was fatigued, facing internal political disputes, and dealing with the after effects of a scandal, the Lavon affair, which we actually covered in the Mossad episode on this very channel, I believe. Indeed, CIA analysts at the time thought Ben-Gurion's decision was partly due to unrelated issues like his policies towards West Germany. However, declassified Israeli accounts later revealed debate on this question. Some senior Israeli officials like Pinhas Sapir and Israel Galilee believed JFK's relentless pressure over Dimona might have played a major role in Ben-Gurion's resignation. Others close to BG, such as his aide Yitzhak Navon, downplayed the nuclear issue, attributing his resignation to a cluster of personal and political issues. So obviously, just to note, conspiracy theorists obviously grasp on this point. And by the way, when I say conspiracy theorists on this channel, I don't mean it in a demeaning way in the way the CIA linked it. I just mean until it's kind of, well, I just mean that, people are theorizing of a conspiracy here in the classic sense of the matter. Given that I do think the JFK assassination was a conspiracy theory is just the easiest way to say it, So apologies if anyone took offense to that. It's not meant to be. Conspiracy theorists seize on Ben-Gurion's resignation as a potential clue. They speculate that Ben-Gurion was so furious or cornered by Kennedy's nuclear demands that he preferred to step aside rather than yield, and more darkly, that he or those aligned with him might have resolved to eliminate the source of the pressure to protect Israel's nuclear project. Michael Collins Piper, a conspiracy author who later championed this theory, even alleged that Ben-Gurion personally orchestrated JFK's assassination in collusion with elements of the CIA and organized crime, after concluding that Kennedy would never let Israel get the bomb. It is interesting that he resigned literally the next day. That's pretty wild. After Ben-Gurion's resignation, his successor, Levi Eshkol, took office as Prime Minister in late June of 1963. And Kennedy didn't let up. Less than 10 days into Eshkol's tenure, July 5th, 1963, the US ambassador delivered JFK's letter, a nearly identical copy of the June 15th ultimatum. The letter was opened with congratulations but reiterated the demand for Dimona inspection schedules. Many in Israel's government were taken aback that Kennedy pressed the issue even harder on the new Prime Minister, and Eshkol and his advisors reportedly viewed the letter as a real ultimatum, a crisis in the making. And Eshkol didn't immediately reply either. In fact, he asked Kennedy for more time to consult and formulate Israel's position on the matter. For several weeks, Eshkol held high-level discussions with his Israeli cabinet, weighing options. It was a tense period. As one Israeli later recounted, Eshkol was surprised and even searching for the right word to express his dismay of Kennedy's blunt warning about US support being jeopardized. Basically, Israel was really concerned that if they were to give in to these demands, it would show their hand in their development of nuclear proliferation. But if they didn't, they could lose the vital alliance that they had with the USA, something that they just didn't see coming. Finally, on August 19th of 1963, Eshkol sent a reply to Kennedy. In this letter, Eshkol reluctantly agrees, in principle, to allow periodic visits by American scientists to Dimona. He proposed a face-saving compromise. Israel would permit one visit by the end of 1963 before the reactor went critical, and then discuss a follow-up visit in 1964. But notably, Eshkol still did not agree to the biannual inspections going forward as JFK wanted. He didn't disagree either, he just didn't explicitly even discuss it. Essentially, Eshkol offered one inspection and a possible second, avoiding a permanent, open-ended agreement. He also reassured Kennedy that Dimona's fuel was under French control and would be returned to France after irradiation, implying it couldn't be diverted to weapons. And this was meant to kind of soothe fears, as Kennedy had a very good relationship with the French government at the time. Kennedy's team internally noted that Eshkol's concessions fell short of the US demand. However, with patience running thin, JFK chose to declare a form of victory on this, and basically acting as if Israel had agreed to regular visits, even though they clearly hadn't. The president basically wanted to keep US-Israeli relations positive, so he welcomed Eshkol's letter as a step in the right direction, essentially assuming that basic agreement on inspectors had been reached. Privately, the administration still planned to push for these biannual inspections, but given that they had an inspection coming up and they had another one planned for next year, they could kind of put this on the long finger and see where it goes, let it play out without rising the tensions any further. By October of 1963, preparations quietly began for the initial American inspection team to visit the Dimona towards the end of the year. Basically, in summary, by fall of 1963, it appeared Kennedy had diplomatically cornered Israel into at least a token compliance, and the crisis over Dimona seemed to be de-escalating. An inspection was tentatively scheduled, and direct confrontation had been averted for the moment. Israel had not abandoned its nuclear admissions, far from it, but it had been forced to temporize and pretend, at least, that cooperation was underway. Kennedy, for his part, likely felt he had managed to, a foreign policy success, balancing firmness with alliance maintenance. But then, obviously, came the big day. November 22nd, 1963, as JFK is driven through Dealey Plaza, shots ring out, and the president is assassinated. And that sparked not one conspiracy, but many, as you will know if you've been watching this channel, or being alive in general for the past few years at least. How does this play into this Israel conspiracy? Well, the scheduled Dimona visit that Kennedy had demanded in late 1963 was postponed slightly in the aftermath of the president's death. It did eventually take place a few weeks later under President Johnson's authority, but by this point in early 1964. LBJ's approach to the nuclear Israel issue, while formally in line with Kennedy's policy, did prove to be significantly more relaxed in practice. Johnson's administration did continue U.S. inspections of Dimona in 1964 and 1965, and Johnson himself insisted to Eshkol that the visits must happen. However, Johnson was a master of maintaining warm relations with Israel and was far less confrontational about it than Kennedy had been. The U.S. inspection teams that visited Dimona under LBJ's watch uncovered no obvious evidence of weapons in works, but only because, as we know now, Israel carefully orchestrated these visits as well, and American inspectors were shown conventional sites and not allowed to see secret areas like plutonium processing areas. They dutifully reported Dimona appeared peaceful, and Johnson's administration largely just accepted these reports at face value. Behind the scenes, Israel in 1964 to 1967 actually accelerated its nuclear weapons program, and this is evidenced by later declassified information. For example, by 1965, the CIA's Henry Kissinger, then a private citizen visiting Israel, came away nearly certain that Israel had embarked on a nuclear weapons program, noting Israeli scientists now spoke confidently of the need for a nuclear deterrent. U.S. intelligence also had found out that Israel had secretly acquired 80 to 100 tons of Argentinian uranium, known as yellow cake, and was developing nuclear-capable missiles, a clear sign that their nuclear weapons were imminent. But Johnson, preoccupied with Vietnam and enjoying strong pro-Israel support in Congress, did not press the issue in the confrontational manner, as we said, that JFK had taken. By 1968, just 5 years after JFK's death, the CIA concluded Israel had likely manufactured its first nuclear warheads, something that Kennedy had been desperately trying to prevent. So by this point, if we were to say, look at this in terms of how I approached the JFK assassination in the documentary, like I said, I'll link below, did Israel have a motive for Kennedy to be assassinated? Yes, sure. They wanted to ease up this and work on building their own nuclear weapons. Did they benefit from his assassination? Sure. The tensions eased, the investigations and inspections eased. They still happened, but they eased. And, it's undeniable that they benefited strategically from Kennedy's absence, given that they now had nuclear weapons just 5 years later. So we'll talk about this in more detail later. The final question, could they have covered it up and so on, we'll get to. But let's just talk about the actual theory then emerging from where we're at now. So within days of Kennedy's death, propaganda in parts of Middle East blamed a Zionist conspiracy for the assassination. For example, one message intercepted by the NSA on November 25th, 1963, asserted that behind the mysterious crime is a carefully plotted Zionist conspiracy linking JFK's death to Israel's past clandestine operations, like the assassination of a UN mediator in 1948 and the kidnapping of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. It claimed Zionists feared Kennedy because he didn't depend on Jewish votes and was about to thwart their power. Obviously, this was politically motivated rhetoric in the region, and there was, at that point at least, we'll get on to if there was later on, no real evidence behind it other than just taking, assumptions from what was going on and so on. But it shows that from the very, very start, some saw Israel as having a motive, as I've just discussed. In 1963, the US and Israeli governments both categorically denied such a notion, and no mainstream investigation gave these credence. The modern form of the Israeli JFK conspiracy theory was popularized by Michael Collins Piper in his 1994 book, Final Judgment. So Piper's thesis was sweeping. He argued that Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion ordered Mossad to participate in Kennedy's assassination as part of a joint enterprise with elements of the American CIA and organized crime. According to Piper, Ben-Gurion was driven to his extreme measure after realizing Kennedy would never allow Israel to obtain nuclear weapons. And Piper alleges that underworld figures Meyer Lansky, an American Jewish mob boss with ties to US intelligence and Israel, facilitated collaboration between Mossad and CIA operatives. He even accuses the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, of the Jewish community of being somehow complicit or at least covering up aspects of the plot. Basically a very complex conspiracy web that essentially says that the CIA and Mossad worked together with their crime links and so on to put together this assassination. For obvious reasons, which I'll explain in a little while, you would be very hard-pressed not to include the CIA in this if you wanted to say that the Mossad did it. There was notable endorsements of this from some interesting characters. Vanunu in 2004, a former Israeli nuclear technician who famously blew the whistle on Israel's nuclear arsenal in 1986. He basically said that this happened, but was not able to give any, concrete proof as to how. Of course, there was Gaddafi as well, who basically used the UN Assembly podium in 2009 to suggest that Israel may have been involved. In a widely reported speech, Gaddafi implied JFK was killed for wanting to inspect nuclear programs in Israel, even incorrectly stating that Jack Ruby, an Israeli, killed Lee Harvey Oswald. For clarification on that, Jack Ruby was an American of Jewish descent, but not an Israeli citizen. That's what I'm saying is incorrect there. But Gaddafi basically conflated the two. Gaddafi ordered that the whole world knows Kennedy wanted to investigate Dimona and thus insinuated a motive by Israel. And of course, there's Marjorie Taylor Greene recently has discussed this as well, along with, Jewish space lasers and so on, which is frankly hilarious. But anyway, I'm not yet saying I don't believe this. I'm just saying Marjorie Taylor Greene and Gaddafi wouldn't be my two primary sources on anything, personally speaking. Sorry if that's annoyed people. I'm sure there'll be comments now. But Gaddafi says a lot of things that were true. Okay. Anyway, one specific aspect often mentioned by theorists is Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Ruby was Jewish, and conspiracy narratives sometimes leap to suggestions that he was working for Israel. So just the facts on this: Jack Ruby, born Jacob Rubenstein, was a Dallas nightclub owner with known mafia connections, but there is no evidence, no hard evidence at least, that he had any connection to Israeli intelligence. Gaddafi claimed that he was an Israeli, which is false and so on. But it remains kind of unfounded speculation. But I'm not going to say that blows it for me, because wilder things have happened, and there was much wilder things going on with Ruby and Jolly West and so on. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. So there was motive, you could say. But means and opportunity is where things become far more speculative in this for me. So I concede there is motive. Whether it's motive enough to do a political assassination on such a huge stage, I guess, is up to everyone. I'm not sure. I don't think it is, but, and I'll get into my reasons why in a few, but you can make up your opinion there. Means and opportunity is another thing, though. And that, I think, is where this becomes far more speculative. So plotting a US presidential assassination in 1963 would likely require influence within the US security apparatus and underworld. The proponents claim Israel's allies or proxies in the CIA, for instance, the fiercely anti-communist chief of counterintelligence, James Angleton, was notably very close to Israeli intelligence, and mob figures like Meyer Lansky provided that means and opportunity to carry it out. That would be the thinking on this. Piper and others basically argue there was a convergence of interests. Hardliners in the CIA, angry over Cuba, and so on. We've already covered all of this in last week's episode, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely links there to say they could do it, but they couldn't pull it off directly. But as of now, there's no documentation or anything that follows that up. But just to finish off, just the facts on this in terms of the evidence. So there's no official investigation or credible historical accounts or evidence, like proper hard evidence, of Israeli involvement in JFK's assassination. The Warren Commission in 1964, which is brilliant, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and while that finding is obviously bullshit, subsequent inquiries by the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, as well as the 1994 House investigations and so on, looked into various conspiracy possibilities, but primarily focused on Soviet KGB, Cuba, and the Mafia and CIA, but did not implicate Israel at all. The files declassified in recent years, including thousands of JFK records released between 2017 and 2025, have not revealed any smoking gun or real hints towards Israel, and even researchers who are otherwise critical of the official story have not found a paper trail of Mossad or Israeli mercenary involvement in Dallas. Mainstream historians and investigative journalists largely view the Israel did it theory with massive amounts of skepticism. Even without hard evidence, the theory persists, and it drew some legitimate questions about this entire thing. So why was Ben-Gurion's resignation so sudden, and what role did Dimona dispute really play? Did the Johnson administration deliberately soften the stance on Dimona because Johnson himself had different priorities, or possibly due to influence from any pro-Israel figure? LBJ was very pro-Israel. We do know that, but there's no indication that this was because of a conspiracy. It was basically a political stance, and because he was occupied, obviously, with Vietnam. And if there's a broader conspiracy involving CIA to kill JFK, is it a coincidence that it benefited the Israeli nuclear project, or could it have been one motivating factor that brought the two of them together? These are the real questions, I guess. So here's a quick recap, and then I'll give my opinion. So President John F. Kennedy was intensely committed to stopping the spread of nuclear weapons and was pushing hard on Israelis' leadership, both Eshkol and Ben-Gurion before him. After Kennedy's assassination, the pressure on Israel's proliferation did subside, and they went on to build their nuclear weapons openly by 1968. By 1968 they had built them. It was open by the 80s. But as of today's date, no declassified JFK assassination files, witness statements, or forensic clues have tied Israeli agents to anything to do with Dallas. So the theory is full-on speculation, right? So my opinion on this. Well, let's take it in the way that I covered this in my documentary recently. Why was Kennedy killed? Like, did they have a motive? Yeah, I think they did. I mean, they saw building nuclear weapons as existential in terms of their way to survive, given that they were coming into various wars. I mean, there'd be the 1967 war going forward and so on. They were surrounded by Arab states, and Israel definitely saw this as, crucial to their existence going forward. So did they have a motive to have Kennedy removed or have Kennedy back down? Sure. Big enough motive to assassinate him instead of using politics and other ways to get around this? I'm not sure. I'll talk about that in a minute. I think there's an easier route there for them. Did they have the means? I mean, in my view, not directly, right? What I mean by that is, did they have the means to pull off the assassination or pull off an assassination? I think sure. Mossad wasn't as advanced as it is today and definitely didn't have the complexity that it has today, but it pulled off some pretty spectacular things by that time already. 20 years, nearly 20 years into the existence of the state, a little bit less, right? 15, 16 years. But when it comes to the final question that I cover in the documentary here, did they have the power to cover it up? No, they didn't. Simply put, they didn't, right? They could blame it on someone else. But if we look at the cover-up, the actual cover-up that we know happened afterwards with the autopsy, the magic bullet, chain of custody, all of these different things that we covered in last week's video, Israel didn't have its hands on that many pies to pull that off. So if Israel did this, they would have needed the CIA, the FBI, and all of those guys to basically cover it up for them. And the thing with that's where this falls apart for me, is that if the CIA and the FBI and so on did that, surely there would have been more documentation around it. And I think there will be less, maybe I'm naive here, I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments, but there'll be less, self-assured reasons to basically keep this covered up by the CIA in terms of ensuring that no documentation ever got out. Because if they could pin it on the Israelis, someone would have done that from within the CIA or within the FBI, or someone would have basically leaked this out by now, and there's just no hard evidence. Whereas there's a lot of hard evidence that the CIA knew about Oswald, that, the FBI knew about Oswald, that he was taken off lists and so on. And even if you were thinking that Oswald did it, Oswald is, much more tied to Russia and Cuba than he would be to Israel. So where do you kind of link that in as well? Obviously, there's a lot of Russian Jews and so on. You could say maybe had some sort of a want to be with Israel. Sure, all of these things. But I think this is a much, much, much bigger stretch than, say, pinning it on Alan Dulles, for example, in my opinion. Because look, here's the bottom line for me. Yes, they had motive, right? Sure. But at the same time, you could look at this and say, well, things had already kind of started to simmer. There are much simpler ways for Israel to kind of get their nuclear weapons than killing the president. They could easily, if there was going to be biannual inspections, start to hide things in different places. They could use their influence in government to ensure that the inspections were kind of bought and paid for. And also on top of this, there was an election coming up in 1964 for JFK. They could have put a lot more pressure on the other side. And also, they didn't actually finish building their weapon until 1968. So worst case, they could delay, move, diffuse. I just feel like if it's in terms of like building this nuclear project, there are many more ways they could have gotten that done around JFK than killing him, and that's a huge risk to their alliance with the US, right? So like if they got found out for killing JFK, immediately their alliance with the US goes away. And the whole point here is they were building the weapons anyway. So the risk was losing their alliance and backing from the US. What is more likely to get Congress, who would have to back up JFK here, don't forget, to go against the Israelis? Continuing to build this, or killing the president and getting found out? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure on this one. I'm just not sold on this one. I just don't see it. I think it's way, like in terms of Occam's razor, there's a way more direct line to Alan Dulles and the FBI and LBJ and the Pentagon than there is to Israel. But maybe I'm naive on this one. Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And I really am loving the comments and stuff on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. And let's get us to 1,000 subscribers, please. I would love that. Goodbye.